From the Beatles to the Rolling Stones, most every rock and roll singer or guitarist who's ever worked an arena full of fans into a frenzy owes a debt of gratitude to Chuck Berry. Berry's music, with its blistering guitar riffs, playful lyrics about teenage life, and undeniable swagger, became the template for countless future rock stars. But Chuck Berry wasn't just a musical pioneer. He was a captivating showman and a controversial figure whose life mirrored the Will-as-Dad spirit of the music he created. Let's take a look at the rocking and rolling life of Chuck Berry. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's go. Chuck Berry was an American singer, guitarist, and songwriter known as a pioneer of rock and roll music. At the time of his death, he had a net worth of $10 million. In the 1950s, he helped shape the genre with hit songs like Maybelline, Roll Over Beethoven, and Johnny B. Good. Because of his significant influence, Berry was one of the first artists inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame when it opened in 1986. Despite finding early success in music, Chuck Berry's path wouldn't be without its detours. Early life and career. Chuck Berry's story starts in St. Louis, Missouri, back in 1926. The youngest child in the family, music seemed to be in his blood from a young age. He even took the stage for his first public performance while still in high school. Life threw him a curveball, though, when he got into legal trouble and ended up at a reform school. After getting released, Chuck had to hustle to support himself. He took on all sorts of jobs, from factory work to cleaning. But music was his true calling, so he never stopped playing gigs with local bands on the side. Then, in 1953, he linked up with a talented piano player named Johnny Johnson for some performances. Here's where things get interesting. There's a story that Chuck actually discovered the sound of true rock and roll for the first time around this period, thanks to a call from a cousin. This new sound would become a major turning point in his life. Success with Chess Records. In 1955, Chuck decided to take a chance and headed to Chicago. There, he met a famous blues musician named Muddy Waters, who gave him some golden advice. Check out a guy named Leonard Chess at Chess Records. Little did he know, this meeting would change everything. Chuck took a blues song he knew, Ida Red, and gave it a rock and roll makeover, renaming it Maybelline. The song exploded, selling millions of copies and topping the charts. It was a massive hit. Chuck wasn't a one-hit wonder. The next year, he rocked out with another hit, Roll Over Beethoven, even though it didn't quite reach the top spot. He kept the momentum going, touring with other rising stars like Buddy Holly and the Everly Brothers. By the end of the 50s, Chuck was a hit machine, pumping out songs teenagers loved. School Days, rock and roll music, Johnny B. Good, and Sweet Little 16 all became classics. He practically invented the sound of rock and roll. In the late 1950s, Berry had risen to stardom, with appearances in films like Rock, Rock, Rock and Go, Johnny, Go. He diversified his ventures by opening a racially integrated nightclub in St. Louis and making savvy real estate investments. However, his success was abruptly interrupted in December 1959 when he was arrested and charged with having sexual intercourse with a 14-year-old waitress. The following year, Berry was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in jail. After an appeal, his sentence was reduced to 3 years, and he ultimately served only 1.5 years before being released in 1963. This setback, though significant, did not deter Berry from pursuing his passions and continuing to make an impact in the music industry. Despite the challenges he faced, Berry persevered and went on to create more music and influence future generations of artists. He was imprisoned for a minor offense. A law meant to fight prostitution, the Mann Act, had a surprising impact on musicians back in the day. Passed in 1910, it banned transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes. This broad wording caused trouble for famous figures like Charlie Chaplin and even boxing champ Jack Johnson. Chuck Berry wasn't spared either. The story goes that in 1959, Berry met a 14-year-old girl named Janice Escalante in a bar across the border in Mexico. He offered her a job working at his nightclub in St. Louis. Things went south quickly, though. Escalante was fired after 3 weeks and then went to the police with some serious accusations. She claimed Berry had assaulted her multiple times during their trip and at his home. A jury found Berry guilty under the Mann Act, sentencing him to 5 years in prison. However, the case wasn't over. An appeals court found problems with the trial and ordered a new one. Even though the conviction was eventually upheld, Berry only served 2 years in prison. After getting out of prison in 1963, Chuck Berry hit the road for decades, playing countless concerts. But unlike most bands, he rarely brought a set group of musicians with him. Why? According to his lawyer, who sometimes even played piano for him, Chuck found it too expensive and a pain in the neck to deal with a permanent band. Hiring experienced musicians would have cost a fortune, so Chuck came up with a unique system. At each tour stop, he'd have the promoter find local musicians to back him up. Here's the crazy part. These bands often played with Chuck without even practicing together beforehand. Twisted Sister guitarist J.J. French says Chuck just assumed any group of musicians would already know his songs and how to play them. Talk about confidence. Chuck's penny-pinching ways even influenced his playing style. His famous technique of playing 2 strings at once? It turns out that was partly because he didn't want to pay for a second guitarist. Talk about a resourceful musician. Mercury Records and return to chess. After getting out in 1963, Chuck Berry didn't waste any time. He jumped right back into performing and recording, pumping out 8 singles between 1964 and 1965. Tracks like No Particular Place to Go and You Never Can Tell became instant hits and kept his name out there. He then switched labels and released 5 albums with Mercury Records between 1966 and 1969. While these albums weren't chart toppers, they didn't stop Chuck from being a major concert draw. The 60s saw him touring the UK with great success, and he even played legendary venues in North America like Central Park and the Toronto Rock and Roll Revival Festival. By the 70s, Chuck was back with Chess Records. In 1972, he surprised everyone with a massive hit, a live recording of a fun novelty song called My Ding-a-Ling. It became his only #1 single ever. He had one more top 40 hit the next year with a live version of Reelin' and Rockin', but that was it for major chart success in the studio. Chuck kept touring throughout the 70s, but he also faced some legal troubles with the IRS. He ended up pleading guilty to tax evasion and served 4 months in jail. The judge even sentenced him to 1,000 hours of community service, which surprisingly involved performing benefit concerts. Talk about a unique way to give back. His tribute was a huge disaster. In 1986, Chuck Berry got inducted into the brand-new Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a huge honor. He was hanging out with Keith Richards, the guitarist from the Rolling Stones, who's a big Berry fan, and a movie director named Taylor Hackford. They got to talking about throwing a big birthday bash for Chuck's 60th. A whole series of concerts at his hometown theater in St. Louis, even filming it all for a documentary. This idea ended up becoming the movie Hail, Hail, Rock and Roll. Things got a little bumpy, though. Keith put together a killer band to back Chuck up, with famous musicians like Eric Clapton on board. They practiced for months, even at Chuck's place. But then, out of the blue, Chuck blew up during one session and stormed out. It seemed like things got tense again later at the theater with reporters watching when Chuck got annoyed because Keith was kind of taking charge. According to a newspaper, Chuck even yelled that he needed to be the leader for his own songs. Luckily, Chuck and Keith managed to patch things up. Unfortunately, the shows themselves weren't exactly smooth sailing. Filming the documentary turned out to be a bigger hassle than anyone expected, causing all sorts of technical problems and delays. The concerts were supposed to start at 6:45 and 9:45, but ended up way behind schedule. On top of that, according to a book about making the movie, even Chuck's singing wasn't quite right on the night, so they had to fix it up in the recording studio later. Not exactly the birthday bash they envisioned. The Beatles copied Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry's influence on rock and roll is undeniable. Legendary musicians like John Lennon and Bruce Springsteen practically worshipped him. When Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones inducted Berry into the Hall of Fame, he even joked that he stole all his guitar tricks from Chuck. There's some truth to that joke. Some musicians were a little too inspired by Berry, so much so that they ended up accidentally, or maybe not so accidentally, copying his work. For example, Chuck Berry has a song called You Can't Catch Me, with the lyric, Up Come a Flat Top. Years later, the Beatles released Come Together, written by John Lennon, with the lyric, Here Come Old Flat Top. Sound familiar? Even Paul McCartney admitted he borrowed a bass line from one of Berry's songs for a Beatles hit. It got so bad that Berry's publisher actually sued the Beatles over Come Together, and they ended up settling out of court. Even Lennon later admitted he was channeling some Chuck Berry vibes when he wrote the song. See? Chuck Berry was so good, he practically invented the sound that other bands were copying. While Chuck Berry's influence on rock and roll is undeniable, his personal life wasn't without controversy. Chuck Berry's outrageous drug bust. Things weren't all sunshine and rock and roll for Chuck Berry, unfortunately. Around the same time some not-so-great news came out about him secretly filming women, there was also trouble with the law. In 1990, police suspected Chuck had been using his musician status for something shady, hiding drugs like cocaine while traveling for shows. They even thought he might be sneaking them around in his guitar case. This led to a big raid on his property in Missouri. Indeed, a complicated situation unfolded for Berry, revealing both good news and bad news. On the bright side, he was cleared of the more serious charge of cocaine trafficking, as authorities found no trace of cocaine on his property. However, they did uncover a small amount of marijuana and hashish, along with a substantial collection of pornography. Among the dozens of tapes, books, and photo slides, there were images of underage women, leading to charges of child abuse and marijuana possession. Berry's legal team negotiated a plea deal, resulting in the sex crime charges being dropped. Ultimately, Berry received a sentence of 2 years probation for the remaining charges. This incident, though troubling, did not define Berry's entire life, and it is important to recognize that everyone makes mistakes and can learn from them. Moving forward, Berry had the opportunity to reflect and grow from this experience, and it is hoped that he was able to make more positive choices in the future. Everyone deserves a chance at redemption and to learn from their mistakes, and it is never too late to make positive changes. Physical and sexual abuse allegations. Chuck Berry's story isn't all about music and good times. In 1987, he was accused of assaulting a woman at a hotel in New York. Things got pretty serious. The woman claimed she was injured and needed stitches. Chuck ended up pleading guilty to a lesser charge and paying a fine. A few years later, in 1990, he faced another lawsuit. This time, several women came forward claiming he had secretly installed a video camera in the bathroom of his restaurant. Chuck said the camera was for catching a suspected thief, but the case never went to trial. He settled out of court for a hefty sum, which some people say was over $1 million. While his guilt was never proven, this incident definitely tarnished his reputation. A police raid at Berry's residence uncovered videotapes containing explicit content, one of which allegedly involved a minor. Authorities also found 62 grams of marijuana. Berry faced potential felony charges related to both drugs and child abuse. However, the latter charges were ultimately dismissed. He pled guilty to a misdemeanor marijuana possession charge, resulting in a suspended 6-month jail sentence, 2 years of unsupervised probation, and a $5,000 donation to a local hospital. Despite facing legal challenges in the later years of his career, Chuck Berry's personal life remained relatively private. Family. Chuck Berry's wife, Thametta "Toddy" Suggs, wasn't much in the spotlight. We don't know much about where she grew up or what her life was like before they met. Things weren't exactly smooth sailing for Chuck before he met Toddy. He wasn't a big fan of school and didn't do too well. Biography says he even dropped out at 17. Feeling restless, he decided to ditch St. Louis with some friends and head for California. That trip turned into a big mistake. They found a gun in a parking lot and ended up robbing a bakery, a clothing store, and a barber shop. They even stole a car before getting caught by the police. Because they were young and it was their first time in trouble, you might think they'd get a break. Nope. They got hit with the harshest punishment, 10 years in jail. They actually tied the knot in 1948, way before Chuck became a superstar. Toddy was known for being tough and steady, a real rock for Chuck throughout his ups and downs, which is saying something considering his career was a wild ride. They had their first child, Darlin, 2 years after getting married. Chuck had to juggle fatherhood with a bunch of different jobs to make ends meet. We're talking factory work, even cleaning up his own apartment building. Eventually, their family grew even bigger with 3 more kids, Aloha, Charles Jr., and Melody. Just like Chuck's music, their family life was full of energy and all sorts of personalities. By the way, that whole California trip with his buddies? It didn't end well. Chuck actually ended up spending 3 years in a reformatory for young men before being paroled on his 21st birthday. He went back home to St. Louis and started working with his dad's construction company. After working a series of odd jobs for 3 years, around 1948, Chuck Berry found support and stability when he met Themetta Suggs, who would become his wife. With her encouragement, he soon reconnected with his musical passion. Berry joined forces with a former high school classmate to form a band. They began playing across black nightclubs in St. Louis, and Berry's unique blend of blues, country, and showmanship started to gain him a local following. Who are his 4 children? Ingrid, the eldest, just turned 66 in October 2016. Melody, born in November 1952, isn't far behind at 64. Aloha, born in August 1959, brings the youthful energy at 57, and Charles Jr., the youngest, is 55 years old, as of August 1961. Let's take a closer look at each of Chuck Berry's children and how they've carried on his legacy. Ingrid Berry Clay. Chuck Berry's eldest child, Ingrid Berry Clay, born in October 1950, didn't just inherit her dad's musical genes. She got the acting bug, too. Ingrid plays the harmonica just like her father and has even appeared in movies about rock and roll history, like Chuck Berry, Hail, Hail, Rock and Roll, and Cadillac Records. As the eldest Berry kid, Ingrid often speaks publicly about her dad's incredible influence. It's clear how much his music and career choices shaped her own life. Aloha Berry. Unlike some children of celebrities, Chuck Berry's daughter, Aloha Berry, born in August 1959, marches to the beat of her own drum. In contrast to the bright lights and constant attention that often come with being a famous offspring, Aloha chooses a life of privacy. While details about her day-to-day life remain under wraps, it's clear that family is important to her. Aloha maintains close relationships with her siblings and makes appearances at events honoring her father's enduring musical legacy. This dedication suggests a strong family bond built on mutual respect and shared experiences. Melody Berry Eskridge. Melody Berry Eskridge, born in November 1952, is the youngest of Chuck Berry's children. She has forged her own path away from the music industry, choosing a life of family and privacy. Melody has been married to her husband, Anthony Eskridge, for over 3 decades, and they have 2 children together. She has expressed her love for her father's music and the impact it had on her life, even if she chose a different path. Charles Berry Jr. Unlike his sister Aloha, Chuck Berry Jr., born in August 1961, followed in his dad's musical footsteps. The only son of the rock and roll legend, Charles Jr. picked up the guitar and carved his own path in music. He's not just a performer, though. Charles Jr. is also a talented songwriter. Growing up surrounded by music definitely rubbed off on him. Charles Jr. often talks about how his dad hugely influenced his musical journey and how being raised in a house filled with music shaped his life. He even got the chance to perform with his dad on stage. In a 2020 interview, Charles Jr. opened up about what it was like being the son of a rock and roll legend and how kind of unexpectedly he ended up playing alongside his dad in his band. Charles Berry Jr. isn't just keeping his dad's music alive, he's actively trying to make it even bigger. He even talked about this goal in the PBS special Chuck Berry, Brown-Eyed Handsome Man. Part of his own love for his dad's music comes from how amazing Chuck was with words, Charles explains. In the early 2000s, something pretty cool happened. Charles was just a regular guy with a tech job watching his dad play live when Chuck spotted him in the crowd and said, "Come on up." Talk about an unexpected turn. Honestly, I wasn't trying to be a professional musician, Charles jokes, and my skills back then definitely showed it. But Chuck wanted someone he felt comfortable with on stage and gave Charles a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Being in his dad's band wasn't always glamorous, though. Sure, Charles got to travel the world and have some crazy experiences, but it also meant a lot of crazy schedules. Luckily, things were different in my time compared to when Dad started in the 50s, Charles says. Back then, segregation was a major issue in the U.S., Still, it was a wild ride. We'd wake up at like 4:30 a.m. with no idea where we were going. One day it might be St. Louis to Dallas, then Paris, then Moscow, all in the same day. We'd hit the stage like 23 hours later, still wearing the same clothes we left in. That's rock and roll, I guess. Charles Jr. laughs and admits he didn't inherit his dad's incredible way with words. That talent seems to run in the family, but it skipped me, he says. It landed with my sister Ingrid and then jumped all the way to my son, who's also a musician. Charles Berry III actually got to be part of a cool tribute to his grandfather. He played on modern-day guitar hero Mike Zito's album Rock and Roll, a tribute to Chuck Berry, which came out in 2019. The album features remakes of 20 of Chuck Berry's classics and even has guest appearances by famous guitarists like Joe Bonamassa and Eric Gales. It was a big hit, topping the blues albums chart. Mike's a phenomenal musician, says Charles Jr. I've known him for years. He actually opened for us at a small club in St. Louis called Blueberry Hill, the same place where my dad played over 200 shows. Mike's versions of the songs are awesome, and I'm so grateful he gave my son the chance to be part of it. He's definitely doing his part to keep my dad's legacy alive. All 4 of Chuck Berry's children have experienced the unique privilege and challenge of growing up in a musical dynasty. They have navigated their relationships with their famous father and his legacy in their own ways. Ingrid and Charles Jr. embraced the family business, so to speak, while Aloha and Melody chose more private lives. Despite their different paths, they all carry the Berry name with pride and honor their father's memory through their own pursuits and achievements. Berry's mansion and another business venture. In 1959, Berry ambitiously expanded his business ventures by opening Club Bandstand on North Grand Avenue, aiming to create a mixed-race nightclub similar to those he had experienced in the Northeast. Unfortunately, his vision did not come to fruition as Club Bandstand struggled to attract patrons. This setback, however, was just the beginning of a challenging year for Berry. In the same year, he found himself in legal trouble once again. Berry was arrested for transporting a 14-year-old girl he had met in El Paso, Texas, across state lines. Unbeknownst to Berry, the girl was also working as a prostitute. After her dismissal from Club Bandstand and subsequent arrest, she revealed to the police that Berry had engaged in sexual intercourse with her during their travels. Berry, in his defense, claimed that she had told him she was 21 years old. This incident sheds light on the complexities of Berry's life, showcasing his entrepreneurial spirit, but also the challenges and legal troubles he faced. It serves as a reminder that success is often accompanied by setbacks and that even the most well-intentioned plans can sometimes go awry. It is important to recognize that everyone makes mistakes and that learning from them is a crucial part of growth. Barry got in some trouble, or Barry had a legal run-in, and ended up behind bars for 5 years. The judge, though, said some pretty messed up things about race, so the whole thing got thrown out and Barry only served 20 months. While he was locked up, he poured his energy into writing songs, and that's where classics like Promised Land came from. Fast forward to the early 1960s, and Barry found his dream digs. It was a huge mansion, think 17,000 square feet, on a big piece of land, 35 acres, near Wentzville, Missouri. He called it Barry Park. Back in the day, Barry played music in St. Louis, but the clubs were segregated, which meant people of different races weren't allowed to mix. He wanted a place where that wouldn't be the case, so he built his own. Barry Park had everything: the mansion, guest houses, a nightclub, even a swimming pool shaped like a guitar. He opened it all up in 1961 and lived there until he passed away in 2017. Sad death. It's a sad note to end on, but in March of 2017, Chuck Berry passed away at his home near Wentzville, Missouri. He was 90 years old. Emergency workers rushed to his house after a call, but unfortunately, his doctor couldn't revive him. It was a real loss for the music world. Huck Berry got a rock and roll send-off in his hometown of St. Louis in April 2017. Fans said goodbye at the pageant, a music venue where Berry himself had played. They even got a chance to see Berry one last time. His coffin had an amazing touch, his favorite cherry red Gibson guitar inside resting on the lining. The Rolling Stones, huge fans of Berry, sent a giant flower arrangement in the shape of a guitar, a cool tribute between musicians. There was a private ceremony for family and close friends, but 300 lucky fans also got invited to celebrate Berry's life and music. Even Gene Simmons from Kiss showed up to give a speech about Berry, even though it wasn't planned beforehand. Sadly, Little Richard, who was supposed to be in the funeral procession, got sick and couldn't make it. The night before the funeral, bars all over St. Louis raised a glass to Chuck Berry, a true legend who left a lasting mark on music. Thanks for watching. If you or someone you know is struggling with addiction, please look for resources and support. Share your reflections in the comments below, and I will see you on our next episode.